Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the ALEC team for a great discussion with our friends in Tennessee. Today, we're joined by State Representative Susan Lynn and Tennessee State Treasurer David Lillard. Susan Lynn was also a former chair of the State Finance Ways and Means Committee, which she is a current member of, and Treasurer Lillard was a former county commissioner in Shelby County. I'm also here with my colleague, Jonathan Williams, who is our Executive Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist at ALEC, as well as a co-author of our annual Rich States, Poor States publication, looking at state economic growth and competitiveness. So, Jonathan, we'll turn to you for some opening comments. Talk to us about the state of Tennessee and what you've seen in terms of their tax and fiscal policy and what's worked well for them.
Well, it's great to talk about a story that works in a state that works. Tennessee's done so many good things over recent years. And as we measure the 50 states in terms of economic competitiveness in our annual Rich States, Poor States report that I co-author with Art Laffer and Stephen Moore, Tennessee's been a top tier state now for a number of years. And a few things really stick out, I think, as to why that's the case. I mean, you could point to just the big things that Tennessee gets right when it comes to overall economic competitiveness. Some of the most important factors is we've talked about here for a long time, Lee, is, income tax. So Tennessee's avoided a personal income tax on wage income. That's just been something that they've had as part of their mix in terms of revenue and spending and taxing. That's something they avoided as one of the 9 states in America without a personal income tax on wage income. It's been an incredibly important economic development tool, not just for them, but other economic powerhouse states such as Texas and Florida and others that are gaining population and gaining economic vitality and job growth. But a couple of the other big things, Tennessee's been a right to work state since the start. And as a Michigan native myself, I never thought I'd see my home state as a right to work state. But we saw and we learned from the success of places like Tennessee and Indiana and others that had gone before us. And then things like property tax is something that we've talked about a lot recently at ALEC. Right. Tennessee has been one of the states that's been a real leader in keeping property taxes low through its truth in taxation law and other elements in order to keep competitive when it comes to property taxes. And you could keep going down the list, but those are the big bucket items. The state pension fund is one of those funded systems in America. I know, to the credit of the representative and the treasurer here, doing some great work in that area. And so we have a lot of good things to say about Tennessee, and really glad to have this discussion with such a good friend and Representative Susan Lynn, and a leader on these issues, and getting to hear about the great work of Treasurer Lillard as well.
Yeah, Tennessee is obviously one of the states that we point to as a model, especially as you mentioned with its no personal income tax. But Representative Lynn, turning to you, what's your reaction to what Jonathan just outlined, and what do you have to add to that? What's your assessment of the economic landscape there in Tennessee?
Well, I thank him for his compliments, and I'm happy that Tennessee is noticed. And really, what I think of is the years going through and how we've pushed for reforms that have really brought us to this point. And I'll tell you, it's taken great leadership. We've had wonderful leadership in our governors, in our state treasurer, our comptroller, members of the General Assembly, who we had a vision, and of course it's not always matching, but it was a vision that was moving towards this fiscal freedom for our taxpayers. We don't want families to be burdened with heavy taxes or heavy laws. We want them to have as much freedom as possible, and there's nothing like economic freedom to create happy and healthy families.
And Treasurer Lillard, do you agree with these assessments? And what's your take on the landscape there in Tennessee?
Oh, yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And I like Representative Lynn. I appreciate the good compliments of Tennessee and all that. But we have been a fiscally conservative state, one that has always aggressively tried to manage any issues that arise. Like you mentioned, the pension fund, for instance, we aggressively manage the pension fund to make sure it is one of the best funded in the country. And the General Assembly is to be commended. We're one of the few states in the country that has funded the actuarially determined contribution 100% every year for many, many years. Every governor and every General Assembly has. So those financial practices, and also just the fact, as we mentioned earlier, that we're a low debt state. We're a low debt state, and we also have a good right to work climate that has been very helpful with our business and industry.
Mm-hmm.
I
would like to add that our debt per capita is about $900. So it's very low. Many of our counties, the debt far exceeds that.
Right.
And so, Representative Lynn, one of the reasons we wanted to get together and speak with both of you today was to talk about the hall tax and this phase out and repeal. But before we kind of dive into the details, could you give us just the backstory on it? What's the hall tax? What specifically was it taxing? What were the problems with it? Kind of take us back to the beginning on it.
Sure. The hall tax was a tax on investments, so personal investments, investments in bonds, stocks, all of that. And it was really a tax that was hitting retirees. And we wanted to become a state where retirees would want to come here and retire and settle down. But also, especially in this age of COVID, where now people are working at home a lot and they can practically work anywhere, we want to be a state too where people who do have investment portfolios and they do earn income from that investment portfolio, that they can come here and live and want to come here, be attracted to Tennessee, because we don't have that investment income tax to burden them.
Yeah, and if I might add, it was, as Representative Lynn pointed out, a tax on the interest derived from notes, bonds, bills, notes, other instruments like that, plus dividends from securities was what it taxed, specifically the income from those. It did not tax capital gains and other items like that. It had a number of exemptions to it, which we won't go into because it would take too long to go through them all. But the bottom line is that's what it was doing, and it was a factor in the decision, I think, of people, whether they wanted to live in Tennessee, of businesses about whether they wanted to be located in Tennessee, because that tax applied not only to individuals, but also to partnerships. For instance, if you had an investment partnership that was investing in underlying securities and you had interest or dividends flowing through, then that entity owed Hall income tax. So, from that standpoint, it was a factor, I think, in some decisions about whether people wanted to do business in Tennessee.
So that was sort of, I guess, one of the driving forces in looking at repealing it was your efforts to attract other businesses or other individuals to your state. I mean, when we talked about it at ALEC, I think we would always look at Tennessee as having an asterisk next to it as a no income tax state, or as not taxing personal income. Because you'd have to remember that the hall tax was still in place and you could still get hit with that.
Yeah, I know. And it was an important debate. I know we were there in Nashville several times educating around this issue, and many of our ALEC members, some of whom are still there, but some of whom have moved on to Congress. For instance, I know Mark Green, Congressman Green now, is very involved in that effort, but also Senator Kelsey, who sits on the ALEC board, and the late, great Charles Sargent, our good friend, was such a big driver of this in the House. And so it was really great to see you guys take this and keep the momentum going and really, remove the asterisk for one, but continue to move people and businesses in the direction of Tennessee.
And since that time, we've actually done some other things too, such as legislation to attract trust to our state. And as a result, I took a look, and as a result, financial services jobs in Tennessee in 2010 there were 139,000 jobs, and in 2020 there were 174,000 jobs. So we really have attracted not only investment, helping people with their income tax and doing away with that, but we've also attracted financial services.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty immediate impact. I guess my next question would be for the treasurer, and that would be, was there a concern over the loss of revenue generated by the hall tax? What were those conversations like? What was the pushback?
Well, I think anytime, obviously, in the legislature or other governing body, when you're talking about removing an income stream, that's always something that's a concern. But One of the particular concerns in Tennessee that had to be overcome was just the fact that this tax was shared with local governments, cities and counties. And so they had a portion of the revenue stream from this. In fact, in fiscal year 16, the year I think repeal was originally enacted, counties received $18.4 million in Tennessee from this tax, and cities received $86.7 million. So from that standpoint, that was a significant discussion point, I guess, in the overall matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so was it sort of based on, if they had residents in their city or county that were paying the tax?
Right.
So I guess you could probably see some counties, they may not collect any of it, whereas others may rely on it quite a bit.
You're absolutely right. The more affluent cities and or counties are the ones who had the largest collections on this because they were more likely to have people living there that filed returns, that invested in stocks and bonds and other instruments, the income from which was subject to the tax. An intensely rural county, for instance, might not have hardly any tax paid from this tax.
So politically, it was difficult because these more affluent areas, their leadership was resistant. They didn't want to get rid of the whole tax. And of course, they opined to their legislators that they didn't want that. However, our constituents were speaking to us and telling us, look, I would very much like you to repeal this tax. And so we kind of did it the slow road. We repealed it a little bit each year, whittled it down until December 31, 2020. That was it. It's gone now. So it was a slow road. I don't endorse the slow road. I really endorse ripping off the Band-Aid and getting rid of the tax if you can do so, because the slow road, you're really not making anyone happy. Your locals are not happy that it's going away, and your constituents are not happy that you didn't fully repeal it once again this year. So it was a long, painful road. And unfortunately, we did have to do it that way. And we did explain it to our constituents because those local governments needed time to prepare financially with their budgets. But we did have a solution to that.
That's right. And as Representative Lynn points out, it was repealed basically 1% per year from 2016 through 2020 is what happened here. And ultimately on January 1, 2021, it went away and all that. One thing that did happen too was during the period of this repeal phase in, that was a good thing in that sense was just that the Wayfair decision came along and internet taxation became an issue too. And cities and counties are receiving more revenue from that. And so I think that helped the situation somewhat in terms of revenue loss for them. But the phase in gave them time to prepare for it and to plan for that repeal.
So, right, we did two different things. The internet tax, that certainly helped our cities and counties recover revenue. And then we did something in Tennessee called the Improve Act, where we rebalanced certain tax rates. We actually lowered the sales tax on food and got rid of the whole income tax and some taxes on capital for manufacturing, but we raised our gas tax. Why do that? Because there were so many people that travel through Tennessee. We are a crossroads state. Lots of transportation goes through our state. And we are now getting more tax revenue from those people who stop to buy gas in Tennessee. And when they fill up, they are helping to pay for Tennessee's roads. And of course, part of that helps the local roads.
It does sound like there were a couple of different moving pieces there. Now, when you think about taxes and spending, two sides to the same fiscal coin, was there any effort to take a look at the spending side of the equation, as you're going to lose some revenue from the haul tax?
I think all of that was being done concurrently. We had a governor, Bill Haslam, who really came in and with very strong organizational skills. And so he employed Six Sigma sort of for government, or CQI for government. He had top to bottom, every State Department board, go through everything and really just throw out the old and reorganize things, which there's a lot of savings in there. It's surprising how many savings are in there. Also, we encourage personnel who were near retirement to go ahead and retire. And we help them do that with, incentives to help them retire. And then another thing we did was we got a hold of our state's real estate portfolio. Buildings are tremendously expensive. So we did things like efficiencies in those buildings and really took a good look at them and try to get rid of some that we didn't need, restore buildings that had been sorely neglected over the years, because we were in a period of revenue growth. So rather than spend that money on new programs, let's fix the roof, let's replace the air conditioner, so to speak, and get things in order. So there were many efficiencies going on simultaneously that weren't necessarily part of the Hall income tax repeal. They were just happening at the same time.
Well, and I asked the question about spending because that's an issue that we see in state and local governments across the country. There's a stat that we point to a lot in our research and writing where, we look at a study that shows that over the past 4 decades, state and local spending has increased by nearly 90%. And that's even accounting for changes in inflation and population growth. But I'll bring in Jonathan here just to kind of maybe give us a little more context and background on that whole piece of the puzzle.
Well, and it sounds, it's a great story from Tennessee. Once again, you really implemented priority-based budgeting, something that we at ALEC have talked about a lot. Yep. Our state budget reform toolkit that many of you are familiar with, that you've seen, things like, looking at what the state owns and assets and reprioritizing, whether that's state or local level. And so, that's all very encouraging, but it's part of the key story of what we've seen success in tax reform is when states do tax reform and they don't do spending reform, they don't get spending control addressed. Then you run into the situation of Kansas, where for years now, we've seen the mainstream media and those that just want to stop pro-growth tax reform look at Kansas and point to that, and really in a myth to say that you can't cut taxes because it supposedly ruined the state of Kansas. And what really happened there in a nutshell, and kind of going through 10 years of history in about 30 seconds, is they cut taxes, they became more pro-growth, but they actually raised spending by $430 million a year that they dramatically reduced taxes. So surprise, surprise, as my good friend and native Nashville resident Art Laffer would say, it's not rocket surgery, it's basic economics 101. And at the state level, in a balanced budget environment, you have to pair good spending policy with good tax policy.
Great points. And Treasurer Lillard, I'll turn to you now. Right now, it's April of 2021. The Hall tax has been completely phased out. Mm-hmm. So where does that put Tennessee right now? What's the current situation? Is the state suffering? Are the localities in trouble? Are all the negative talking points that were given, are they coming true? Where's the state right now?
Well, luckily, none of that is true at present in Tennessee, and we know it won't be in the future, most likely, because it has paid off, if you will. Using priority-based budgeting, as mentioned a minute ago, and all, we've been able to make sure Tennessee's competitiveness shines through, and revenues follow that, in my view, because right now, Tennessee, we had a little downturn during March and April of 20 when the pandemic first hit in our taxes and revenue and all, but we've recovered very nicely, and we're over collecting versus our estimates and have been every month since then, and are projected to continue that. So it's been a good story, and that's also with the fact that it's not only the Hall tax, but we also repealed the inheritance tax, the gift tax. As Representative Lynn mentioned, we reduced the sales tax on food. So there's been a lot of initiatives, that are coming together at this point. I think what it's showing is Tennessee's competitiveness, as I said, is shining through.
Mm-hmm. Another thing we did 2 years ago, I think it was, 2 years ago, we actually repealed our professional privilege tax for 17 of our professions. So that was a $400 a year tax for people like engineers and other folks with a professional license in Tennessee. And they are very appreciative. In fact, since I first ran for office in 2002, I've had constituents as I knock on doors, Susan, please repeal the professional privilege tax. It really is a burden. And we were finally able to do it for 17 of those professions. There's 6 remaining that are still taxed. And we are chipping away at them. We should reduce it by $100 this year when we pass the budget, and with a goal to completely eliminate it. But that's another tax that we have repealed.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask you, you've done such a good job with the Hall tax repeal, but I was wondering what's next from a tax and fiscal policy perspective for Tennessee. I mean, do you have your eyes set on other reforms or continuing on the path that you've set yourself on? It sounds like things are going well.
Yeah, we feel like things are going well. We always want to be cautious. There's always legislators who, come along and they want to get rid of every tax. And unfortunately, you have to support what government is doing through taxes. But we also want to be reasonable, and we don't want to overburden our citizenry. And I feel like our citizenry thinks we're at a good balance. I don't think they feel overburdened. And really, if you compare Tennessee's tax burden to other states, we do fare very well with the tax burden upon our families.
And I wanted to ask each of you, I mean, as we talk to state legislators from around the country, and you do as well, if you're at the ALEC meetings, what do you want them to know, or what do you want them to take away from what Tennessee's been doing? What are some great lessons learned for other state legislators?
Wow. Well, I think that listening to the experts, reading reports, you mentioned Art Laffer. I don't know if you know this, but Art Laffer had moved to Nashville, and many in the legislature had befriended him, and his influence certainly is a very good influence upon us. Certainly Alec's influence is an excellent influence upon us. I think legislators need that sort of education. We need to hear from economic experts so that we can be guided truly by experts like our state treasurer here and other leaders that we have in our state. Legislators come into the legislature. We are, we're really citizens, and we need that education. And I really encourage all legislators to participate with organizations like ALEC to seek, the top economic advice, and not to go with whims or fads. That's not where the stability lies. If you want to have a stable state with a growing economy, you really need the best advice that you can find.
And I would say too, that it's important to set strategic goals for state government, and to engage in priority-based budgeting as part of that. And having done that, I think what Tennessee's experience shows with the Hall tax and with other instances is you can reduce taxes dramatically and eliminate taxes where appropriate, and make that work from an economic standpoint, as long as you have a holistic approach to both the spending and the taxing side. So from that standpoint, that's one reason I think, and Susan Lynn, I think, is an example of the leadership that gets you to that point very, very quickly over time.
Excellent points. And Jonathan, anything that you'd add to wrap things up for us?
Yeah, I have a few things. It's a great discussion. Really appreciate the insights of two real leaders there in a state that's doing so well that I think so many of our members across the country are continuing to look at states like Tennessee to figure out how to emulate that success. One question I did have for both of you before I give kind of final thoughts is, I mentioned it briefly earlier as a Michigan native, but how big of a deal is right to work in terms of Tennessee's success? And you've seen the in-migration of a lot of businesses. You've seen auto manufacturing, go to Tennessee. You've seen so much of that. And in our example in Michigan, we went through a single state recession, and we had new leadership come in after 2010 and said, we can't keep doing the same things that we've been doing and expect different results in Michigan. And we saw the success of Tennessee and Indiana and others that went before us. And we were losing out on so many of those manufacturing jobs and other jobs because of not being a right to work state. In the case of Governor Rick Snyder and the conservatives in the legislature at the time, they realized it was a yes or no decision for a lot of these companies that they wouldn't even consider a state unless it's a right to work state. So I'm curious as to what's the story on the ground there, since Tennessee's been in one of the longest standing right to work states in America.
We have been a right to work state since in the 1940s, 70 years. And truly, being a right to work state helped us attract those first auto manufacturers that came to Tennessee. Right now, we are working on a constitutional amendment to put right to work actually in our Constitution. It is a law, it's been a law for 70 years, but we want to amend our Constitution to say that we are a right to work state. And I really think that'll be a great attraction for industry coming to Tennessee.
And I think it's also important for expansions of existing businesses and industries. You know, many people overlook that in their thinking, but most economic development officers will tell you that one of the easiest places to build your base is to expand the industries that you have in your state now, or the business you have here now. And a lot of those decisions, the right to work is very, very important in that. So I think it's been, as Representative Lynn aptly points out, it's been very important to Tennessee.
Well, that's an incredible effort to enshrine that protection for workers in the state constitution. And I know that's been something Tennessee's done by also protecting against a personal income tax in the Constitution. And so I think that's very good from a permanency perspective and giving businesses that predictability to continue to invest in Tennessee. But I think this has been a great overall conversation. I think that this picture is so vivid as the model that works in Tennessee. And we've known based on our research in rich states, poor states for years, just the linkage between being a no income tax state, becoming a right to work state, and population growth and income growth and job growth. And here you are now, gaining a couple of 100,000 Americans on net as people continue to vote with their feet from the high tax states to the low tax states, especially the clear linkage without an income tax. And now, of course, with the repeal of the hall tax, just another reason, another feather in the cap of Tennessee to be one of the most competitive states in America. So we couldn't be prouder from all of your fantastic efforts to continue to move this in the right direction in Tennessee, and keep up the great work.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Representative Lynn and Treasurer Lillard, and Jonathan, for this great conversation. For more on the research that Jonathan outlined in Rich States, Poor States, you can go to richstatespoorstates.org. And with that concludes our conversation on Tennessee and economic growth and the hall tax. Thanks for joining us.